for working with those. And also, I just wanted to maybe work into that conversation, just publicly presenting the results of the committee report. This one might get more attention than others, so just maybe reserving a little bit of time for thinking about how that will proceed. But for now, let's get into the discussion of chapter outlines. If no one else sees any other thing, okay, good. Okay, so the first one on the agenda is the affordability chapter that Dallas and I worked on. And I think everyone has read it. I was going to give a 1-minute overview and then really open it up because I really value comments I've already received, but also whatever else people have in their sort of top of mind. How we structured this was a quick overview of just like the setting the stage for this larger conversation, which is just rising consumer costs in California, and in particular energy prices, which are relatively high and increasingly out of line with the rest of the country. And the reason I wanted to start with that is I think it may be some confusion about what's driving energy prices and the role of carbon pricing in that. And so we sort of laid out, thank you LAO for our Bureau of Labor Statistics in this case for some nice graphics, which I will consolidate and make more concise. But then we sort of turned to retail energy prices, and I was going to have slides, but then I realized I didn't want to have slides because we're still fine tuning like the numbers, and there will be a spreadsheet with all the numbers and references and sources. I should say this is building on work I'm doing with Severin Borenstein and Jim Salee. But starting with electricity, just observing that the electricity prices are high and rising, and trying to pretty coarsely, but hopefully it's useful, decomposing those retail rates into like private marginal costs, what it costs a utility to provide 1 more kilowatt hour, the greenhouse gas compliance cost, which is just an estimate of the marginal emissions intensity of electricity multiplied by the prevailing carbon price, and then everything else, just to really drive home the fact that the key drivers of electricity rate increases in recent years has not been the carbon price, but things like wildfire risk mitigation and new infrastructure investments and some other climate policies. And here's where I didn't know what people thought. I thought it might be useful to contrast the retail rates people are paying with a measure of social marginal cost. And that measure is inherently, like, there should be huge error bars around that estimate because it's leaning heavily on EP estimates of the social cost of carbon, which is a very hard number to pin down. So one thing I really wanted to get your thoughts on is that a useful benchmark? Because I think why I wanted to put it in there is that what it shows is that retail residential households in California are paying prices that are much higher than what we estimate to be the social cost of electricity consumption, even using the social cost of carbon of $190 per ton. In contrast, natural gas and gasoline prices are still below those estimates. So I just thought it was a useful frame of reference, but it is one that sort of hinges on a lot of assumptions and sort of uncertain estimates. So the punchline of the chapter is just to go through and estimate coarsely the percentage, the impact of the observed carbon prices in 2023 on residential retail energy prices, just to put things in perspective. Dallas then did an, I thought, excellent job summarizing some of the modeling exercises that have been done to forecast California carbon prices going forward, recognizing and sort of talking a little bit about how challenging those modeling exercises are. But then finally, we have a table that says, okay, using some of those forecasted carbon prices, what would that imply for residential retail energy prices, gasoline, electricity, and natural gas? Gasoline, electricity, natural gas. Like a detailed forecast of those price impacts is well beyond the scope of an IEMAC chapter. So all we did is say, like, let's hold fixed market conditions in 2023. Let's swap out the 2023 price for one of these forecast prices and see what it does to prices. So that was a big picture idea of the chapter, but we are open to comments, concerns about any aspect of it, and we're not wedded to any of it. So stop there and invite people's candid reactions and thoughts.
I have thoughts, Danny. Oh, there's hands
great.
too. However you.
Yeah, maybe we'll start with Caitlin and then we'll.
Sure. I guess I'll start by saying, I mean, I really appreciate all of the work that has gone into this. I mean, I think as we've discussed at length here, like this is front of mind for the legislature on so many fronts is how we address affordability and cost of living. So I think addressing these questions is timely and helpful. I will say I want to make sure, and I recognize there's pros and cons of separating out the affordability and the cost containment, cost effectiveness conversation. I want to make sure they don't get totally separated, though, because I want to make sure that what, even when we're reflecting existing modeling or other studies, price projections, that it is in the context of other things driving these prices. And I'm thinking specifically of gas prices.
Mm-hmm.
The CEC has great data showing all of the impacts on gas prices. And like, this is actually a really small amount of what goes into gas prices. It's not nothing. But it's very small compared to, and so I just want to make sure that we have that appropriate context. Or with there was a couple other examples I had of just making sure we're putting things in context of cost effectiveness and other drivers of prices. That way we don't run the risk of one thing being taken as a standalone statement that becomes the thumbnail of the whole report. Because reporters do that.
Yes, and I really take your point. And I should, so one, I think what you're saying, and I think is to just go through and every time we're talking about these price impacts, keep reminding people of what we focus on in the cost containment chapter. Like this is the most cost effective. The other thing I didn't mention in my overview, but is really important is like, those electricity bill impacts, they're offset on average by the climate credit. Those natural gas impacts, those are offset on average. The gasoline price impacts could be offset using TGRF funds or what have you, but are not currently. So just within the chapter showing that we're trying to address these, preserve the carbon price signal, offset the affordability impacts, but I completely take your point. It seemed like a long chapter to have cost containment and affordability all wrapped into one, but I think we can keep pointing at the cost containment chapter and leading maybe with the cost containment chapter so that it.
I think that would help me a lot because I don't want to hide the ball. I think people are asking these questions and they deserve answers. But they also need context. So I think what you're suggesting makes sense.
Great. Danny. Your hand is up, sorry.
It is. Thank you, Sarah. Just unmuting. Appreciate that. I want to echo that comment. I think just to draw out, Meredith, what you just said, having some clear summary language on approximately how much of the sort of gross price impact by the three main fuel categories, what that is, and then what what that looks like with what I'll call the transfer mechanisms currently in the program, including the utility rebates. I think having some succinct language about how that affects the different fuels is important. Some of that was in there. I just think that's useful to punch up. The other friendly comment I would make is it would be really helpful to be crystal clear about the units. Like a lot of the economic discussions conflate nominal and real units on the dollar terms, and it doesn't. Whatever is appropriate. I just want to make sure it's really clear in the text, and at times it wasn't entirely clear. So thank you. Really great work.
Great comment. Great, thank you. Dallas, I saw your hand next.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to linger on one point that is strong in the chapter, but could not be said in my mind strongly enough. And that is that coming from an economic perspective, there is no general theory about how to recover sunk costs in a network system, like a sewer system or something like that. There are arcane approaches like the Shapley value that are impossible to implement. But really, we don't have guidance from economics about the efficient or necessarily fair way to recover the sunk costs of the electricity system. And that includes transmission, but also wildfire costs. The reason it is so important to this committee is that this committee is part of California's climate policy regime, which is dealing with a crisis. And the way that the legacy, the way we inherit, the way fixed costs are recovered in the electricity system is working an exact opposite to what we need and want to accomplish with decarbonizing the California economy. So especially if you look at electricity, the carbon market is there's little to criticize in terms of its impact on electricity prices, and the rebates keep households whole. Meredith's work does a great job of showing the social costs of in the gasoline are even greater than what's getting passed through. But the main point, I think, is that this is an issue that needs to be elevated above CARB. It's an issue for the legislature. Meredith has written about this in academic work before, but I'd really like to see us trumpet this in a message of the report, the whole report for 2024. It's time to take these kind of pricing seriously if we want to rely on private sector and individual decision making to the maximum extent possible to drive decarbonization. Because we are just at the market grounds. We cannot take this product to market in terms of the way the way costs are structured in the California economy with the goal of addressing climate change. It should be of top concern to everyone.
Great. So
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go for it.
I was
Yes,
just going to say, I'm getting a
ahead.
lot of noise. I don't know where that's coming from, but I just wanted to flag.
Bill, could you check and see that everybody's, do you mind checking that everybody's muted? That is not speaking. Dallas, I just wanted to follow up really quickly up on that. So, these fixed costs, right? Like in terms of the way we're doing it right now is quite distortionary. So I think I just want to make sure I understood that comment so that I can articulate it correctly in the chapter.
Well, Meredith, I think you understand it really well. I just didn't do a very good job, perhaps, of making the main point. But the main point is that electricity prices are too high.
Yeah,
and they're too. There's no economic guidance on exactly what they should be in terms of recovering fixed costs, but they're hurting us. They're working at cross purposes of California's climate objectives, and it has to be taken seriously. And until they are, I don't see that we can achieve residential and commercial sector electrification the way it's needed to occur.
And I agree with that. I guess and I don't mean to like split hairs here, but if I were writing this, I would say, what economic theory says is, if you could recover it sort of lump sum in a non-distortionary way, that's how you'd want to do it. And that was sort of like the idea behind our income graduated fixed charge, is like, if you do that uniformly, well, that's regressive. If you do it progressively, but that is the guidelines from economic theory, is that you want to recover those costs in a way that doesn't distort other trade-offs. And so I will draft that, or I'll try and draft what you're saying, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree. I just want to make sure what I write is in line with what you have in mind.
No, I think that's great. Obviously, there's a lot to be said about that approach, but even more broadly, I think that they could be removed from the electricity sector.
Yes, and we've written elsewhere, and so maybe at the risk of being self-referential, we can point to summarize the punchlines of those other writings and point people in those directions. Brian?
Hi, guys. I'm going to reference the paragraph on the alternative climate rebate design.
Yes.
You talked about kind of the lower income. I think this is timely. I know you guys don't wake up every morning and pull up the newspaper from Bakersfield, California, but Dean Flores, who actually is a state senator here, sits, I think if he's either still sits on or was at one time on the Air Resources Board, had an op-ed today in the Bakersfield Californian, very similar to this. So again, I think it's very timely. Appreciate how you talk about, the lower income households being disproportionately affected. He takes it a step further and talks even more kind of regionally. Summertime, some areas, electricity bills could be up into the $400, $500, $600, whereas other parts of the state don't. Yet the rebate system is more kind of general. So I just wanted to point that out, that op-ed dropped today, and I appreciate you guys including that in your chapter.
Great, thank you, Brian. I know there's a placeholder here. Michael Wara, Danny, maybe you've seen it, have also recently released a report on this topic, so I was going to try and cite it, making similar points to what you just articulated, Brian. So thank you. I will look for the op-ed and also substantiate this discussion with some references in the final draft. Okay, can I just push a little bit? Are people okay? So I found it useful to contrast the prices with the social marginal cost. Are people in agreement with that? Because you're inviting sort of criticism and questions as to how one constructs that social marginal cost. And I did that cost benefit analysis and decided it was worth it. But I'd be curious what other people, is that useful? Is it a distraction? Is it like not important? Because it adds length and it adds details that if it's not delivering any value, it's not worth it. Danny?
I'm wide open. I thought the approach you took was very sensible and sound, and I appreciate you could have an infinite number of debates about the details. But I think it's useful, particularly if you want to make the point that having additional price impacts on some of the fuels where the current price is below the social cost is justifiable from that perspective. I think it helps support that. I think if you're going to continue to do this, which again I think is fine from my perspective, it's going to be really important to find some really succinct summary language and maybe think about a summary sort of front end to this document that makes a couple of the key points and then
Yeah.
has kind of a longer back end that I think many readers will not want to get into the details. It's important to show that you've done the thinking and substantiated the views. But my personal preference would be to say, here's what we can say about the impacts on fuels, about where they are, about whether that's higher or lower than the cost the consumption of these fuels impose on the world, and some issues around the transfer mechanisms and the net incidence of the price impacts. Because that's really, I think, what policymakers are asking about. They're saying, is the price too high or too low? Are higher prices acceptable under what conditions? And I think we want to give some really summary information to inform that conversation that would be based on I think, the very thoughtful analysis you've done.
That's great. And that's what I had attempted to start to do on that first page, but I can certainly sharpen, like, it's just helpful to hear from you all, sharpen that and put, more focus on that first page. Helen,
I think it's great. I think there's a lot of just fantastic content in this and so helpful. And so I don't know that I have much in terms of helpful commentary. I think, again, I mean, it is, I think if there's one challenge, it may be that there's, it's on the lengthier side. And so to the extent that there are little areas to try to kind of, maybe be more concise if that makes sense. That's great. But I actually personally kind of like having the social cost of carbon stuff, even though there's no perfect number, as you say, and it's subject to uncertainty, just giving folks a sense. So I don't know if you need to get into the details, but at least the general concept, it seems like a critical one, because I think it's important for people to understand that it's not just like, oh, our rates, high or not. It's like, okay, well, actually, we may not be using as much electricity as sort of we should be, right? And maybe we're not, even if we priced in the social marginal cost, maybe we're ahead of that. And so I think that at least that sort of overall concept is a crucial one. And whether we cite all the specific numbers, I don't know, but I think they're helpful. But okay.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I guess the only thing I'd say in terms of like length and readability is I like how you've got key things in bold. I think that helps for I'm just thinking of like ledge staff that are totally overworked and may have to just skim this for, the bold sentences in the conclusion. I mean, I don't know if moving some of it even to an appendix would help with length too, but I think the content is, I think it's helpful. I think this is what IEMAC can bring to the table is like thought processes like this. So I'm supportive of keeping it, and maybe we're creative about just like structure and organization, but I support keeping it.
Okay, thank you. This is helpful. Dallas and I can get to work on this. Are we okay? Should we take public comment on each chapter? I think I'm inclined to do that just because this is going to be a long conversation. So, okay. Bill, maybe you can help us with this because we don't see anyone. If there are public comments on this chapter, now would be a good time to weigh in.
Meredith, may I?
Yes. Yes, please.
The public hasn't seen the chapter. So
okay.
All they can do is respond to this conversation.
Okay, you're right.
So and there was so much work for us to do now. I think that the tone of the committee might come together as they listen to the whole thing and then hearing public comments at the end. I think
Fantastic.
would be of service to the public.
Okay, I really appreciate it. Great. So I retract that invitation. You're exactly right. We'll talk through in general terms on the material we're covering. There will be a report released soon, and we'll take public comment on longer conversation at the end. Thank you, Dallas, voice of reason. Okay, so the next, unless there's anything else on that chapter, I believe the next chapter is cost containment, but we've agreed that it will come before the affordability chapter in the actual report. Brian and I worked on this chapter. Here again, I really welcome your candid feedback. I thought, but this is like the professor in me, that it would be useful to have like a cartoon model just to elucidate, like, okay, here's what a cap and trade program is designed to do. This is why we like it. It doesn't need to know what the low cost options are in advance. It's a mechanism that basically acts like an auction. You raise the price until you got the abatement you want. And the reason I wanted to work through this is primarily because I think what is sometimes misunderstood is the interactions between companion policies and cap and trade. And when you mandate more expensive, that pushes the permit price down and pushes the cost up. And that's kind of sometimes counterintuitive. And so that's why I have this kind of silly cartoon rainbow graph, which I'm happy to cut if people don't think it's like insulting, or happy to keep if people think is useful. But that sort of sets the stage for a discussion that Brian and I worked on of like, okay, we've got this idea of how these things interact, and we hopefully have clarified why cap and trade can be really a powerful tool at containing costs. And we've really argued at the beginning that cost containment has to be one of our top priorities. Let's look at the companion policies we've both implemented in the past and are proposing to implement potentially in the future, and sort of ask, like, how do they seem to compare against the prevailing carbon price or projected carbon prices. And here again, I'm not sure that this is the right model, because what I did was collect as best I could. And these are really hard estimates to construct, let alone construct well, but just pulled from work I've done, work colleagues have done to say, okay, here's a ballpark estimate of the implied cost per ton of greenhouse gas emissions reduced by solar subsidies, by EV subsidies, by the RPS, just to get a feel for how these companion policies compare. And some of them, the costs look much higher than the prevailing carbon price. Others look pretty cost effective, meaning that if we hadn't mandated them, the market would have called in those abatement options on its own. And then I just kind of cut and paste the table from the scoping plan without really understanding like the details of how these numbers are constructed. But again, it's just a point of reference from like the public information that's available of what kinds of cost estimates are out there and how they compare against permit prices. And again, just to really elevate, the reason I see this as an important chapter is if we ask, like, should we put a price on carbon or not? No one likes higher prices. The answer would be no, thank you. But like to really put forward what that means. If we don't have a cap and trade program and we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, that means we're trying to anticipate and pick low cost options, and that's really hard to do. And I would be willing to bet that we will end up having a higher abatement cost than we would if we'd relied more heavily on the market. So that's the overview. And like I said, like the other chapter, not wedded to any of it and want candid commentary from everybody on any aspect. Dallas.
Okay. First of all, is it my microphone that's causing all this noise? I'm sorry. Let me see. Hopefully this is better. Can you hear me okay now?
We can hear you, yeah.
I'll try not to move when I speak. Maybe that's the issue. I like the chapter, and I don't suggest changes to the chapter in my comments here. But for the earlier discussion about putting this chapter first, I think the format of the chapter, which works very well, does not work so well as the first chapter in the report, because it's like you got your professor code on, and we're talking about A plus B plus C and these graphs. I think it's really great to have this as part of the report. I'm just thinking it's a little bit disorienting for us if we want to come, unless there's a really strong introduction, maybe that'll solve this problem. So I'm not coming to this with a strong opinion. I'm just raising, I think there's a problem with the report if this is the first chapter as written, and I don't want to see you rewrite it because I think it works well. So I don't know what to do. I just wanted to put that out there. While I've got the microphone, I'm going to make one substantive point. You go to great care to list several reasons why one might want to do companion policies, and I think the one you don't mention, I put a comment in the draft. One of the most compelling reasons is to drive innovation, especially where there's and investments where there's network economies or a need for infrastructure or human capital. Workers learning the trades, consumers learning about products. So this is one of the reasons that you might use companion policies until the market is ready to just take over. So I just would like to see some mention of that added, but that's a note for you to get back to.
Yeah, that's great. I buried it in the second. It's like biodiversity and technological change. I think what you're saying, which is a very good comment, is just pull that out and say there's a third reason, and that's like there's innovation and network externality market failures. So it's easy to do. Good suggestion.
Good point.
Yeah. Brian?
I just wanted to say how honored I was to work with Dr. Fowley on this. It is one of my favorite chapters, not just because my name's on it, but I think this is super important because I think we kind of started this whole exercise this year through the lens of reauthorization and wanting these, quick, easy access things for legislators and staff. And then I think here after the election, there's this other lens now that we have to look through, and that is the importance of cost containment and affordability. Like that's kind of marching order number one that we're getting from above. So I think it plays well into that conversation. It's super important, and want to thank Dr. Fowley for all her work on this.
Thanks, Brian. It was an honor to work with you, sincerely. So really appreciate your work on this.
I mean, I think I agree with everything that Dallas and Brian have said. I think my only outstanding question is, this is really specific, is on the RPS section in the appendix. I was just really surprised to see the $10 a ton figure, because I've long time had in my head the LAO figure, which is more like 60 to 70. And that's a really big difference. And I'm sure there's a good reason why there's a difference, but I just think we should maybe explain that here.
Yes, and Helen, I don't know, because let me briefly explain how we did this. The Padilla reports, like utilities have to report their procurement costs under the RPS and non-RPS generation. So you can just look and see, like, what are they paying for qualifying renewables? What are they paying for other procurement, like natural gas? We just looked at the difference between like how much more are you paying, and then we use estimates from the literature and like just replicate them using California data. Like when you build that wind turbine, what are you crowding out in terms of like thermal emissions, and just said cost per ton. I suspect the LAO was looking at earlier renewables contracts, because remember in the early days, the RPS did not look so good because we were mandating more expensive renewables. And to Dallas's point, like it's hard to disentangle how much of the innovation and the cost reductions were driven by things like RPSs, but like we've seen these big reductions. So I don't know if you would be able to help with understanding earlier.
I might have to circle back with you on that. Because I'm not entirely sure. I think my general sense was, I think my understanding is that our analysis was also based on those Padilla reports. But exactly how, and then I think we just looked, if I'm recalling correctly, at the bundled customers and sort of attributed the additional costs like to them, but I'm not sure how we dealt with like the the other side,
I would love to, and we may be doing it. I mean, I would love to make sure that our methodology makes sense, and that you like these would be what you've done. So if I can follow up with you and get details on how you did it, because the last thing I want to do is put wrong numbers out. I mean, in the sense this makes sense given what we think we know about where wind and solar costs are today. But there's
a logic to it.
I know, but I think your point is great, and I think we should at least have in this appendix that maybe no one will read, but like noting this estimate is quite a bit lower than earlier reports from the LAO, and here's why, or correcting our math if it's wrong.
And I think there's been some national work too that Berkeley Lab has done. I don't know if you've seen on the estimating the cost of RPS.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the numbers that kind of we had cited about sort of the 5%, I think, or ish of retail rates was in line with some of that other work that had
Okay,
been
we should
done.
because we consulted with some of the LBL folks just on art. So this is a long
Yeah, so
conversation.
I don't know. That was just, again, I've not gone deep in this stuff.
No, but I would
so
like to get it
think
right.
that
I
it's
don't want to
just,
put something out this front. So I will follow
yeah.
up with you and we will make sure we had some back. This is coming from a report I wrote with Severin and Jim, and we did have people push back and there was some back and forth. And so I want to make sure we get it right.
And Helen, I'm looking at the January 2020 Assessing California's Climate Policies Electricity Generation Report.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's the right thing to be
I
looking
think
at,
that's
but
the
that's
thing that I'm thinking
Okay.
of at least is that report. And so I think that's the one that had
Yeah.
that reference. And but there's been, again, I think the Berkeley Lab stuff. I don't know if you're familiar with that sort of work, but
We
they've
work
done,
a lot with them.
Yeah, but they've done some work on the RPS stuff.
Okay.
So
it'd be good to, I mean, and I know when we
Definitely
did this
sources.
very same calculation using early contracts, much more expensive, much
Yeah.
bigger. So it would be great to.
yeah, I don't know, unfortunately, but yeah, we can circle back.
that was my only.
No, that's great.
shout out. I think cost containment, like Brian said, super important. Really glad that we've got this whole chapter dedicated to it.
Yeah, and if I can just circle back, Dallas, because I think your point is really well taken. I just want to make sure I understand how we should act on it. Like, longer wind up in the introduction here, like, or.
Don't we usually have an overall introduction
Yep.
to the report? And I wonder if that might be the soft entry that readers need before getting to formulas and graphs. I don't know.
We can try that approach. I want to honor and respond to. Yeah, maybe we can try that, Dallas, which is like an introduction, and then a longer, like at the outset, kind of along the lines of what you were encouraging us to do with the affordability, just like here are the key points that we're going to make in this chapter and see if that works.
Yeah, I think that would indeed would work it. And as I stop to think about an introduction preceding this chapter, then I think this chapter is much more accessible. So that's the way to go.
I will try, and then I will invite more comments. Okay, the only last, again, like in pushing you for a little bit more, I am on the one hand a little bit reluctant to include all these like program specific cost estimates, given that they are a course. Like some of them, the EV subsidies I'm much more confident in. That's Joe Shapiro and Hunt Alcott, who spent the past year of their professional lives working on those calculations. And then, Danny, with the LCFS, I don't know if you like, I'm just taking the LCFS price and waving my hands a bit and saying, well, these are going to underestimate the true cost for these reasons. Is that worth like laying out that material, and that could be a distraction if people disagree with it? Or is it warranted? Because what we're trying to just show people is that if you don't reauthorize the cap and trade program, but you still want to achieve your ambitious climate goals, that could be much more costly road to travel down.
Sorry, was that a question directed at me?
The question is it worth having these course estimates to make that point, which could be imperfect, like the estimates you could take issue with some of these, right? So how we did the RPS calculation, how I'm interpreting the LCFS price to make a point. So an alternative chapter would be much shorter and say, look, the evidence out there, I'm not going to get into it, suggests that some of these companion policies are much more costly than the carbon price. We don't have to have these for examples, but so this is the question I have for you. Is it worth having these specific examples that may be imperfect, but they really sharpen the point? Or should we take them out and just say, we've got companion policies and there's a literature out there, and trust me, some of them are quite costly, and that's why we're advocating for the cap and trade program to be an important part of our cost containment strategy?
I'm really torn because I hear both sides of that. And I want to be respectful of the fact that several of these policies, there have been pretty serious debates about how to run those numbers correctly.
Yeah, exactly.
And while I think you've done a really thoughtful job of introducing it, I guess I think it would be not the best outcome if this was seen as us trying to resolve those issues definitively.
Right.
I also think just sort of hand waving and saying there are costs and they're different and usually higher is also not satisfying.
Yes.
So I'm in
Yes.
favor of a middle ground. I'll probably have some comments on the LCFS, which I think is maybe a little bit less well developed than the very thoughtful discussions of the rooftop utility scale RPS and EV subsidies. But yeah, I mean, I think the general point, and I think it helps illustrate in a concrete way to policymakers who know the names of those other programs that there are real costs attached to them, and I think that's important. So
Okay.
I think we need to be careful given the disagreements that are present in other policy areas that are a little bit outside of our formal scope, not to try and define the answers without more dedicated work than we've been able to give to this. So I'm happy with all the squishiness.
Okay, I completely, because the last thing I want is this to be a distraction from the point we're trying to make. So that's, this is what, Dallas, sorry, you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, I like the chapter as I already said once. And I like the fact that we have, as like the way Danny just put it, that I think we're, in the ballpark for how to think about these companion policies without pretending to resolve academic or important regulatory discussions that are ongoing.
Okay.
But the one thing I want to mention is that, and about the LCFS, I think Danny's work and others may say that there's hidden costs to the LCFS.
Yep.
I don't think we should do anything more than mention that some sources say that, and it kind of it balances the innovation argument that I already raised.
Yes.
The one point that is relevant here is when we talk about the dollar per ton of the LCFS and dollar per ton generally, it doesn't map into the affordability narrative directly, because the dollar per ton of the observed dollar per ton of an LCFS credit, notwithstanding hidden costs or hidden benefits, but the dollar per ton of an LCFS credit is not reflected in the change in consumer prices. It's an intensity standard. It's only a percentage of that cost is reflected in the change in, for example, the price of gasoline. So I don't think we want to open that up and talk a lot about it because it's confusing. But I think we also have to be real careful about saying that if the narrative is directly around affordability, some would argue that tradable performance standards are an advantage from a consumer perspective because they suppress the change in consumer prices.
And I agree. And that's, I think, why we wanted to separate the cost containment chapter from the affordability chapter.
Yeah.
Because I think we can say here, like it does cost more to reduce a ton this way versus that way, even if the mapping to consumer prices is more convoluted. I don't know if you agree with that. Like here, we're just saying, look, if we're just thinking about how do we achieve our emissions reduction goals at least cost, that's what this chapter is about, and that's what those are the comparisons we're trying to make. But I don't know if does that make sense?
That's great.
I was just gonna say I agreed with Danny's previous point there about we can't solve all of these questions here, and I have mixed feelings about putting a price per ton.
Oh yeah.
I know the climate advocate in me gets a little stressed about this, but I think in a conversation about cost containment, this is a very fair point that we should be making, and I think like a lot of other things in this report, IEMAC is uniquely positioned to make. So I agree with Danny that I think sort of the squishiness of how we've walked this line in the middle of not trying to solve these other questions, but also try to be clear about at least a sliver of the universe.
Yes.
And costs associated with those policies is on the whole more helpful than not. So
okay, great. And so I think what I will try and include more sort of qualified, because I agree the cost of ton is like an inherently imperfect, inherently incomplete, but it is a metric that one can use to start making these comparisons. So just make those qualifiers more clear.
And adding Dallas's point about there's a lot of other benefits too, which we've got in here.
Yes, and more humility, or more just like caveat that these are course metrics. They are not meant to be the end, like the final word, but just an attempt to summarize some of the information that's available that helps. Okay.
Perfect.
Danny, did you have more? I saw your hand, but now it's gone.
Just briefly, I think that on the LCFS, I agree with Dallas's description of the cost impacts. I think that'll be hopefully pretty straightforward to address. And I wanted to flag, I certainly have concerns with whether or not any of those climate benefits are real, but the market price is the market price. And so I think it's a very directly analogous thing to look at. Thanks.
Okay, and please edit that section as you see fit, because you are the expert. I am not. Yes. Anything else on this?
I love your professor figures. Maybe it's the fact I love all my economics classes, but I thought that they were super helpful because I feel like people can say generically like, oh, cap and trade is the most cost effective, but like this explains it and why. And I haven't seen it explained this clearly and this, this well, I think ever. And so I really appreciate that. At least from my perspective, it was really helpful. And then, I think the points that were made again on at least one of the things sometimes I do, and I don't know if there are places that maybe this would be appropriate, is just like, sometimes it's just sort of acknowledging, like being really clear someplace, like that there's sort of some uncertainty in these. And, this is to give a sense of scale, if there are, especially if there are certain ones that were particularly, that have maybe a higher level of uncertainty, given what we know. I think to the extent it's appropriate, it could make sense to just add that kind of caveat-y language so a reader, people still will just take out the numbers, but in some cases, but I think it can sometimes be helpful just to kind of remind folks that, okay, different reasonable minds can disagree about exactly the number, but here's one estimate that we put together that we think is credible, and we think it gives it the overall story is, which is the most important thing, is look, cap and trade is generally cheaper. So I think, I don't know if there's any little spots that would make sense, but maybe that's kind of an in-between like taking out the numbers and.
Yes, great. Okay, this is super helpful. Thanks, everyone. Anything else before we leave cost containment and head into allowance allocation? Okay, thank you. Danny, do you want to lead the allowance allocation discussion?
Sure. So this draft chapter builds on the outline we discussed at our previous meetings, and the sort of main contribution it's seeking to make, and is now fully drafted, is to try and present a big picture of essentially how money moves in the program, using the allowance budgets as the starting point. Although, as we discussed in earlier meetings, I was able to include some related data on offsets funding flows that I think help complete the picture. I've been struck, I get requests from policymakers to sort of give, what's the 101 version of how the pie is allocated, if you will, in the program. And most of the reporting data we see is on the GGRF, and occasionally we see reporting data on the climate dividends and these important features of the program. And the goal here was to trace in an apples to apples way a sense of how the allowances are divvied up, if you will, as well as the approximate financial flows that are calculated from that using average annual price data. So the beginning of the chapter has a figure that tries to pull all this together. And again, one of the reasons this was a motivation for me was you hear, numbers like the GGRF has been raising between $4 and $5 billion a year. Well, it turns out that's about half of the flows in the program. And there's almost $10 billion a year of transfers and mechanisms in the program that can hopefully be depicted a little bit more clearly. I walk through that, as well as in the chapter, some discussion of the specific motivations for the different allocations to industry for the purposes of protecting against leakage, for utilities and all of the complexities of the different utility allocations that are present, for the reserve accounts, and for the auctions, to try and give, again, for policymakers coming new to this program, the sort of 101 version of what's been done, and some pictures basically that help depict the fractional allocations within the annual allowance budget. So that's the bulk of the descriptive work. The chapter closes with a short discussion of the policy options, because you can imagine policymakers could slice up the pie in different ways in the future. The policy interventions are not meant to be highly prescriptive. They're more like, if you wanted to bring in more GGRF revenue, you'd have to cut something else. Conversely, if you wanted to have more utility rebates, you'd have to cut something else. It's just sort of to tie the logic together of how you could increase or decrease the shares of these different current decisions, and the high level implications of doing that. One last technical note for folks. I believe I circulated the spreadsheet that I used to do this work, which I'm happy to release as part of the full IEMAC report. I did these calculations, especially on the financial flows, on the basis of issuance. And I think that's probably the only straightforward way to do this because of the complexity and the timing, especially of the auction cycles of vintages. A downside of that is, as you'll recall, in 2016 and 2017, when we had undersubscribed auctions, there was actually quite a delay in some of the allowances that were made available at auction actually entering the market, and they entered in different years at different price points. And the figure that I've produced intentionally does not account for that. But because we haven't had those dynamics for several years in the program, its recent years, I think, are perfectly reasonably representative of the financial flows. And so I've tried to indicate that with an appropriate caveat. I want to make sure everybody on the committee hears that, because if you look at the approximate financial flow in 2016 and 2017, that's not the correct way to think about the GGRF. But that's the implication of slicing up, approximately half of the allowance budget for the GGRF. And the actual time dynamics, because of uncertainty around the program's authority at the time, are different than what are depicted here. Again, there's no simple way to do this, and I came to the conclusion that this was the simplest way to present an apples to apples approach, so long as you understand it's not good during those periods of more difficult market operations. And it's pretty straightforward in the last several years because we haven't enjoyed those. We've enjoyed not having those problems. So let me pause. This is a chapter that Caitlin and I were working on. I wasn't able to get this to her until a little bit late, and I know her comments are fairly recent, so I want to make sure maybe she should start by sharing some perspectives on what she thinks, but to make sure this doesn't reflect anything she disagrees with.
No, I appreciate that, Danny, and yes, I believe I added my comments at about 7 o'clock this morning, so apologies that my late turnaround as well. I guess I'll start by saying I think it's very helpful to share sort of this breakdown of where all of the allowances are going, and at least from the point of view of CARB and the regulation, why they're going there. I mean, I think reasonable people can disagree if they like that approach or not, but that's what the program is right now. And I think making it clear to policymakers is important. So I really appreciate all the work you've done on this. I think my biggest question that I flagged in a number of places here is more just a clarifying one. And that is this, it's really about offsets. And the question of looking at issued offsets versus offsets turned in for compliance. And I see your point. There's pros and cons with both thinking about offsets and allowances issued versus turned in for compliance. I guess since you made the very good point that there was a difference with allowances back in 2016 and 2017, I do think it would be helpful to just put a sentence or two sort of clarifying, like, we're looking at issued allowances, or excuse me, issued offsets. In actuality, the value is lower, or even just the number is lower, because we have not seen the maximum allowed offset use. And just drawing that distinction between issued and used for compliance the same way you did with the allowances would be helpful in clarifying. And I think I had a few like specific word choice things, or which we could talk about now if you want, but I don't think it's up to you. But that was substantively my biggest sort of overarching clarification request.
Great. I'm very happy to follow up on that. And just for the committee's full benefit, this is everything that's discussed in this chapter and presented in the figures is done on the basis of issuance. So exactly as Caitlin suggested, there have been substantially more credits issued than have been used for compliance purposes. And I agree, it's very important to be clear about that and welcome feedback on how to improve that.
Alice, to you.
I love this chapter. It's everything I hope for. It's great. I have one comment that I'll put in it that I think about the 2016-2017 event, Danny, and that event occurred because of the priority sale of utility consigned allowances over GGRF or state-owned allowances. I think that should be, even if you leave the graph the way it is, I think a little bit more should be said about the fact that it misrepresents the revenues to the state in those years and why. And just in order to without promoting anything, elevating it as something that might be considered during reauthorization, whether that idiosyncratic program design is something that's advantageous for the state. Thank you for this chapter. I know it's a lot of work and it's great. I really appreciate it.
I love this chapter also. I thought it was super helpful. So much great information. The figures I thought were just spot on and gave me a better appreciation of sort of the allocations over time and across industries and sort of entities. So I thought it was fantastic. And I know the offset part is hard, but I think it's an important piece of the story. So I really appreciate Danny's attempt to do his very best to kind of make sure that that's reflected too. So I thought that was great too. So it's amazing to me how much everyone in this group, how much time and energy has been put into these chapters, and I think it's just so helpful.
And so I'll add a lot of fan base here, Danny. This is a great chat. The graphs are great. I've always wanted to do this, but you are the guy to do this. It's really super helpful to have it all in one place and very clear. I guess I have an organizational question that more pertains to the larger report and what belongs in this chapter versus scattered elsewhere. And also so this free allocations to utilities, I tried to track this number down for our affordability chapter. I couldn't find it, but I suspect you have it in your head. I think it's important to distinguish the free allocation to leakage exposed industries is trying to mitigate leakage. And then this free allocation to utilities, which I think of as free allocations to utility customers and ratepayers, because so much, but do you know how much? So there's this line in here, public electric utilities can use the allowances as they see fit. But at the same time, I thought they were sort of compelled to allocate it to the climate credit. And my thought is that the climate credit is a large share of that. So do you have the numbers on that? Or are those numbers not, I think, knowable?
And I apologize. I need to do more work on how the publicly owned electric utilities do this. I haven't spent much time with that. So it may be that is where I need to do a little work. I welcome public stakeholder feedback because I haven't spent a lot of time on that. The only place, Meredith, I would offer just a friendly point of disagreement is I think that the gas utilities are actually kind of a hybrid treatment. Because they were only required to consign a growing proportion of their allowances to auction that increases to 100% by 2030. So at least from my perspective, the gas utilities feel like kind of a hybrid of transition assistance and ratepayer benefits. Whereas I think it's fair to say the electric utilities, it's for the purpose of ratepayer benefit. And I don't mean to summarize this too succinctly, but the presumption that a publicly owned electric utility, anything they're doing soundly in their operations contributes to ratepayer benefits. So it wasn't necessary. And because they're also not directly regulated, there isn't a mandatory program attached to that. So I was trying to reflect all of that nuance. It is very hard to succinctly describe in a way that's accurate to all parties.
Yeah, I guess because this is going to be a focus, right? With affordability and thinking about what we should be doing to mitigate impacts on households. I was just wondering if I would have benefited from even more detail here if it's easy to get, which it might not be, of what share of the allowances value that's consigned to the quarterly auctions actually flows through in the form of the climate credit and what doesn't, but maybe that's hard to get.
I haven't previously pulled it. It's theoretically available.
No, I'm not assigning more work to that. If it was easy, I would put it in here. If it's hard, then that's fine. My other question, if I may, is that so originally Dallas and I were going to write a whole chapter on leakage. CARB's commissioned studies on leakage. They're not yet out, and we felt that other chapters were priorities. So there is no chapter on leakage, and so but there's content in the environmental justice chapter that gets into how the leakage output-based allocation works. There's content here. So I guess I feel like we could do a better job across chapters at consolidating that information. And it's more of a question that we can be thinking about as we work through the chapters. Should more of that belong here in this chapter where you do such a nice job of laying out what flows where? Or so it's just an organizational question I'd like to pin is I think there should be somewhere in this report details as to how those output-based allocations are determined, because they could be subject to change. And I didn't know if it was here or elsewhere. Dallas, sorry, you have had your hand up.
No, just per the earlier conversation, it's in regulation what the allocation is through to the natural gas and electric utilities to the end of the decade. And but for the POUs, they are, as Danny said, they are not required to consign. This was a topic that came up in one of the workshops in the last 12 months. I believe CARB was exploring the possibility of requiring consignment, and I think that some of the POUs were opposed to it. But in any case, that everything that Danny said is my understanding also that you have this on-ramp for the natural gas utilities moving towards full consignment by 2030. And that POUs, I think about 35% of their allocations get consigned, but it's left to the boards for those POUs to decide what to do.
And my understanding on the POUs, which is limited as well, but was that there's certain things that certain types of programs that sometimes POUs have trouble funding because of Prop 26 limitations, and so that's sort of one of the things that these funds potentially could or have been used for is sort of some of those programs, like for example, providing benefits to low-income customers, which there may be some Prop 26 challenges around. So I think there's sort of its own sort of unique issues, I think, around the POUs.
Super helpful. Thank you.
One more thing, Meredith, sorry, but Danny, on this, like, I think you need to decide, what committee needs to decide how much detail to put in this chapter, and it's really works well as is. But if we want that more detail, we could invite the public and either public comment now or correspondence afterwards to give us further detail about those allocations, because I'm sure I got it wrong to some degree. And I think the chapter works well as it's written currently.
Great. Anything else? No. Thanks, Danny.
Not on my end. Thank you.
Outstanding chapter. I think the next one, well, Danny, you're up again. I think is offsets the next on the agenda.
Yes, that's correct. Let me just pull that up my screen here. This is the chapter that Dallas and I worked on. I want to thank Dallas for some really thoughtful engagement on this. The purpose of this chapter is to try and give both a quick introduction to the program, its overall structure and size and performance, and then to review the academic literature that has been documented over the last several years about how the program is performing. I should mention that in describing the purpose of the offsets program, the goal of this descriptive part of the chapter was to provide very neutral analytical foundations for the different features that carbon offsets bring, which can be good or bad depending on one's point of view and the performance of the program, because those purposes are relevant to any potential reforms, including keeping the status quo. I think the overarching direction I want to again highlight for the committee's benefit, until the extension bill AB 398, decisions about the offsets program were largely delegated to CARB under a series of high-level statutory criteria around the quality of the program. AB 398 set specific quantitative limits that were lower than were used in the past, and there are no limits in statute, and I believe also not in regulation as to the post-2030 version of the program. So absent a specific direction being taken, the sort of, ground is wide open on all of that. So appreciating that I am one of the people who has written peer-reviewed scholarship on this program, I think it's fair to say the scholarship is pretty strongly tilted toward there not being a lot of positive findings and quite a few negative findings. Those findings are reviewed very briefly and succinctly, and the chapter closes with some potential directions that could be taken to address some of those concerns. Those directions include putting offsets under the cap, which is more or less the flavor that Washington State implemented in its cap and trade program. There's also a discussion of replacing the use of offset credits directly as a compliance instrument with dedicated funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There's also a discussion that Dallas has introduced, and Dallas and Caitlin have had some exchanges on whether these changes should potentially begin before 2030, or whether any changes that might be implemented would better be left to the post-2030 period. In discussing all of these potential changes, the chapter ends by referencing the effects of changes to the offsets program on cost containment, on the pattern of statewide emissions, including as how those show up in the inventory and are counted towards the state's goals, the specific considerations relevant to tribal parties that are involved in the offsets program today and could be involved in either that or replacements tomorrow, the specific considerations specific to environmental justice communities, and considerations around how changes to any of the program rules would affect current market operations and the need to be attentive to those directions. So that's I guess, maybe a good brief introduction. I might turn it over to Dallas and welcome any feedback communication from the committee. Very last thing before I do that, I just want to point out, we talked a little bit about in the last chapter, the important difference between issuance of offsets and compliance use of offsets. We have data on the first 3 reporting periods that are publicly available, describing, among other things, the use of offsets for those compliance periods. The compliance event for the 4th period, covering the years 2021 through 2023, occurred in November of this year. And typically those data are released in late December or early January. So I anticipate that coincident with the timing of this report, we should be able to fill that in and connect some of the dots to extend the observed compliance use we've reported on in previous IEMAC cycles. So I'll stop there, hand it over to Dallas, and I know Caitlin, among others, will have some questions, and very happy to go from there.
Thanks, Danny. No, I'm just going to talk about one point and just to serve up Caitlin to give her a chance to make her viewpoint known. And that is the issue of the expansion of eligibility for offsets in 2026 from 4% to 6% as written in statute. I think all I would ask is that this be mentioned, and I would look for the phraseology to say in half a sentence that the alternative or not increasing offset eligibility to 6% provides an opportunity to explore a comparable expansion of investment in natural and working lands using other mechanisms such as procurement. We know that this can't be done by card. It would require legislative intervention. I think that we know that, and I would just leave it at that point for interested parties to be informed about that. Caitlin, do you want to let your view be known?
I'm having a little trouble putting them into sort of some succinct thoughts here. I put a lot of comments in this chapter, and I like a lot of the policy recommendations that are coming out here. I mean, I have consistently been excited about the idea of thinking about offsets under the cap and think that is a worthwhile thing that we should again be asking, the legislature to consider. I will say overall, I think I fundamentally have some philosophical differences with the direction where this chapter is going. I don't think there is enough discussion of the many benefits of offsets, and I am not talking about cost containment necessarily, but more talking about tribal benefits. I think one of the comments I put in here is, looking at all of our draft chapters, we have air quality and environmental justice considerations all over the place, which I fully support and think is very appropriate. And we have one paragraph at the end here talking about tribes with respect to offsets. And I think that is a significant disservice to all of the work that tribes have done in this space and the immense benefits that they have received. So I mean, that's one piece. With respect to pre-2030 and post-2030, I do not think we should be opening up a conversation with the legislature about changing anything with respect to offsets pre-2030. I think this needs to be squarely a post-2030 conversation at this point, especially if we're talking about revisiting the offset usage limit. And then I guess broadly, I made a lot of recommendations, which, I think we can go back and forth on a lot of these, just with respect to some, I guess I'll say word choice and just sort of the framing. And I think some of this can be resolved with us all being more precise in our language, myself included, to make sure that what we are saying is what we really mean and the meaning can't be misconstrued. And so I think we can have some offline back and forth about some of these proposed edits and sort of where I'm getting hung up on some language. I think I will stop there for now.
Danny, I see Brian's hand up, but Danny, do you want to respond to those comments so we can sort of make sure that
Yeah, I think really briefly, this is really important because I was involved in the cap and trade extension negotiations in 2017, and every
As
white
was
bro,
I, so
every
I
white bro
recall.
in a Patagonia vest kept referencing the tribal interests, and Caitlin, I really have to strongly disagree with the way you presented this chapter in a public discussion because it emphasizes the tribal considerations ahead of the environmental justice considerations, and it's very explicit that that needs to be front and center in these conversations. So I want to emphasize that that is a point of agreement, and the description you offered, I think, is not a fair description. I also think we need to pause the meeting for a moment because for the better part of 7 years, I have been arguing that we need to have very clear conflict of interest policies, which have never been implemented on this committee. And I think it's very important right now for all of us to disclose any potential conflicts of interest, including grants given to our employers to work on carbon offsets regulation in California and in the voluntary carbon markets, or any other financial conflicts of interest members of the committee might have in relation to this topic. I will begin by saying I have previously consulted for a carbon crediting registry called Isometric that works with carbon dioxide removal activities. I don't represent them. I'm not currently working with them. And I currently work for the United Nations on the Article 6.4 mechanism as a member of the methodological expert panel, and I don't work for them or represent them in this conversation. I welcome any other additional disclosures from the committee at this time. Thank you.
Danny, I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for or implying here. I mean, Environmental Defense Fund has worked on carbon market issues for decades. And of course, we receive funding to do that. It is fundamental to our theory of change. I mean, I'm not going to go through a $300 million organization with every piece of funding we've ever received related to carbon markets.
Yeah, Dan,
Are
I
you
guess
representing Environmental Defense Fund's views in this conversation?
Just like all of us, I am here in my personal capacity. I am not here because I work for Environmental Defense Fund. I'm here because the speaker asked me to be here and appointed me to be here. And I don't think we need to continue this conversation at this point.
I'm just happy to note again for the full group that we still don't have a conflicts of interest policy 7 years in. I think we need to work on that. Thank you.
I take your point, Danny. We can put it on an agenda for a future meeting because I think it is. I mean, I work for UC Berkeley, so I think I'm not saying it's not an important conversation to have, but I think it's a hard request to field in real time, given the very large organizations that we all represent and the roles that we play here versus the organizations that we are affiliated with. I don't know if I don't want to preclude other comments in response to this particular issue. I also don't want to spend too much time on this issue at this point in the meeting. Dallas's former chair, I don't know if you had anything. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I really respect your judgment. You've probably thought about this more than I have. Are you okay to move on, or do you feel like this is a?
Well, we should have a regular annual disclosure of conflict of interest. There's a bigger discussion about the form in which that takes. So that's very well and good. Danny seems to think that there's some special interests involved around this issue that would be different from other issues we're talking about, whether people mutual funds that own electricity stocks or have taken consulting from electric utility companies or whatever. And I don't feel very good about the process of interjecting into this conversation right now, that point that Danny raised. So, but for the record, and I hesitate to go further because I don't really want to legitimize the conversation here, but I don't have any conflict of interest that I can identify. I've never taken any revenue or done any funded work on California's offset program. I have done work and have outstanding proposals about voluntary markets. I'm not a big fan of voluntary markets, but I've done work in that regard from an international perspective.
Okay, I'm gonna follow your, I mean, I feel deeply uncomfortable about engaging in this conversation at this point in time, but I don't wanna so let's put it on the agenda for next time, recognizing it is fraught given very large organizations and how to interpret that, but let's put it on the agenda for the next meeting and we can engage in it at that time. Brian, I'm sorry, you've been standing there with your hand up very patiently and I've been,
So back to the offsets chapter.
I think so. That was, yes, back to the offsets chapter.
So I just want to start by saying, kind of telling on myself here, how excited I was to hear that this exercise this year report was going to be like I talked about earlier, kind of the Cliff Note type chapters on the program, right? It's a big, complex program, and I'm, as everyone knows, new to the table. And for lack of a better term, a layman when it comes to a lot of this. So I was excited to hear that we were going to work through this, and it's been super helpful. All of the chapters have done a great job of explaining kind of each of these things. It's really helped me start to wrap my head around kind of what we're dealing with here. So having said that, this chapter especially seemed a little different to me, and I not to be critical to the authors. I just, as a layman, right, my observation, I guess you could say, was why I walked away from it more as an editorial rather than a kind of this list of facts and, these very general recommendations. I got the feeling that, offsets are bad, all this, and I would guess there's a difference of opinion on that as I've reached out to some other, trusted stakeholders. Sounds like there are differences of opinions on that. And so, and especially I think as it relates to this cost containment thing that has kind of driven this conversation, especially this year. I know it is bulleted very briefly kind of towards the end. And so I would just wonder, as a suggestion, and I didn't make any necessary edits really to the document itself, because I feel like my comments were more general. Again, apologize to the officers to have this conversation more public instead of on that. But again, I think if I was to make a suggestion, I think really focusing more on really the purpose of, from what I understand, offsets were intended for, and this cost containment piece. But to just spend 1 or 2 sentences on it in light of what we're trying to do here, I think would be doing a disservice to the committee. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Brian. Danny, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to say. I'll come back to it in the carbon management chapter, but I do want to ask if any members of the committee have identified any relevant peer-reviewed literature that speaks to the actual performance of the program that has not been cited or appropriately discussed in the draft chapter. I do take some reservation at the suggestion that this is an editorialized position. Frankly, I think anybody who's familiar with the literature on this or other programs would recognize that this is actually a pretty comprehensive treatment of the recent literature. It also includes a piece, for what it's worth, that is authored by the lead scientist of the Environmental Defense Fund, who happened to say that the results I calculated were not as bad as the results he calculated. So I think it's worth emphasizing here that the peer-reviewed literature has been very stark about this program, maybe even more so than with some of the other large programs that are well documented in the literature. And I guess I sort of question the suggestion that reviewing that literature is an editorial exercise, particularly if it hasn't missed a key study. And I would welcome any suggestions for omissions that should be included. Thank you.
So am I conflicted, or EDF agrees with you?
Well, Caitlin, you're more than welcome to express a position about the Randazzo et al. Paper.
So that paper was published, I guess, 2 years ago now, perhaps. And the lead author on that was a postdoc who did, look at the IFM protocol and found that, and I honestly haven't read it recently, but, found that there were needed updates to how the baseline was set. And I think that is a perfectly reasonable position to say we need to go back and update these protocols to make sure that they reflect the latest technology, latest advancements in methodology. And that is something that EDF has been saying is, we support forestry offsets, and we think the protocols need to be updated. The protocol in this case needs to be updated and updated on a regular basis. And I think we agree on that. So I have no problem with you citing that paper.
I'm not hearing any omissions, but thank you.
Are there any other?
I mean, I thought there was a lot of great content here. I think it's an important issue. I think we are going to be talking about that, offsets among many other issues that the legislature is going to face. Offsets are one. So I think understanding, what we know about them, what the literature says, I think is really crucial. I guess I'm not familiar enough with the specifics of the literature to weigh in about, whether there's anything else or not, but this to me read very well. And I felt like I learned a lot. Again, I'm coming in from a place of not I don't have the deep knowledge that many on this committee do. So a place of, I want to be very humble about that. But from my perspective as sort of someone relatively new to this area, I thought this was very helpful and there's a lot of good content here. So, and I do feel like there's value in having some discussion of offsets that helps people understand that they're, kind of the role that they play and some of the issues that have been brought up. So
yeah, so I think this chapter is it has to be here. It's a really important chapter. I agree. And I guess, Danny, I would, and Dallas, I'd be curious. I agree with Caitlin's point about being squarely post 2030. I think that's was the objective or the framing of the report, is a forward-looking report toward. That's not to say we can't talk about evidence and studies that have been written before, but if we could maintain that as a focus, that would be my preference. And I want to make sure we leave time at the end, because I think what we're hearing, and this is what an independent committee is supposed to do, is thoughtfully disagree when there are disagreements to be had. And so thinking, and we've done this before, and Danny, you've played an instrumental role in sort of guiding this in terms of making sure there's an opportunity in this report to have differences of opinion represented in the report. And so maybe we can make sure to have time at the end to just revisit how that will be done and make sure that that's clear. Yes, Danny, you have a response.
Yeah, no, I want to actually respond directly there, because I think that's really important. We've worked through a lot of issues together as a committee where there have been differences of opinion. And, I think for the most part, we've done a pretty good job of trying to draft our work in a way that responds to and is reflective of those differences of opinion. And I guess I'm really struck. It feels like something is changing in this report cycle around that. And I think when we get to our next item, or I guess a couple of items on the carbon removal chapter, I think it's pretty squarely not going in that direction. I appreciate that some of the issues discussed in the offsets chapter are uncomfortable because the program hasn't been working and is widely documented not to be working and is universally documented in the peer-reviewed literature not to be working. We can express different points of views about what to do about all of that. And I've tried in the chapter to avoid making unfair statements about either the evidence or the consequences of different potential changes, including, frankly, leaving the thing alone and doing nothing. So, I'm a little nervous, and when we get to the carbon management chapter in particular, I am very nervous that we are no longer embracing a norm of when there are differences of opinion, we try and find ways to describe how the different committee members look at that to produce something that is responsive to the full direction of the committee, rather than starts with a myopic set of approaches that frankly privileges a certain set of financially interested stakeholders, some of whom are represented on this committee at this point. And I do think that that's a challenge for us to navigate. So Meredith, I am 100% behind being responsive to different committee views. If we need to express things differently, if there need to be places where we explicitly note disagreement or different points of direction, I'm 100% on board, and I hope we will apply that norm to all of the committee's work this year. And I'm very concerned about the state of other chapters with respect to that norm. Thank you.
Okay, so we can talk about that chapter. I don't sense a departure from where we've been. I sense a very palpable disagreement on important issues. And I guess I hope going forward, we can just, based on the facts, document where people see facts differently. But I don't, maybe you are more prescient than I, it's quite possible, but I don't see a dramatic departure from where we've been in the past. Just trying to be, I mean, as independent and as facts-based as we can to inform a really high stakes public conversation. Yeah. Dallas?
I hesitate to draw this out
Yeah.
further, Meredith.
No, I think it's important.
You're muted,
Oh,
Dallas.
Dallas, you're
Okay,
muted.
okay, but I think it's helpful to linger on it for another minute, because so that we have a path forward.
Yes.
I feel like this chapter has a lot of great information, and my reading of it was that it didn't reach a conclusion, and it was pretty balanced in its presentation of information. Danny cited the literature that he knows well, touching all the points of criticism that he and others have written about it. And one could go searching for if it's in the gray literature or advocacy or people with financial interests could make a comparable set of points about the advantages. But at the outset of the chapter, we identified three main policy design elements of the chapter, which has to do with cost containment for the program generally, driving some investments in targeted sectors, natural working lands, and shifting where emission reductions occur, which is not so much of a design motivation, but a core effect of the offsets program. So, well, I think what Brian's point is raising is that maybe reading this chapter, it looks like it's different than the other chapters because it brings forward all the criticisms. I think we should figure out what we want to do with this. I think that the way the chapter is written right now actually comes off as balanced. But the way we've been talking about it the last 5 minutes is not balanced. It reflects a point of view that we're independently different points of view. And I think it's really informative for readers from both sides of what's presented in the chapter as it is now. So I'm in favor of keeping it in the chapter in the way it is now, because I think it's on net really constructive. It makes a lot of good points, and there's some little fixes that each of us can make in terms of providing edits. But Brian's view otherwise is if it gets much more murky or conflictual, then I think it really is going to sink instead of float. It's going to sink, and it needs to be then replaced by something that's really summary in nature. Maybe it becomes a big appendix or a thing that people independently want to offer as supplementary addendums to our report representing individual points of view. As of right now, the way this chapter is written, I think it holds everybody together. I think I anticipate that everybody can put their name on this chapter as written. So I just want to say that I can, but if it goes very much in one direction or another, I'm going to start to think differently about that. So that's where I'm at right now.
I appreciate that, Dallas. And yeah, I wasn't suggesting that I think this is a core chapter. I just sensing some tension, wanted to remind people that, if consensus, like if we can stick to the facts, Danny, I really appreciate your invitation to offer alternative studies that you are omitting. Like that's exactly what we should be doing in terms of trying to summarize what we know and what we don't know about a really, important issue. I just don't want to push out voices that know more than me about this issue and don't feel that their voices are, that their sense of how the facts is being reflected here.
I think this is all resolvable. I mean,
great. Yeah, I mean, I don't see
I think we just
divisions. At all in this chapter, and I want to make sure that that's in the report because it's core.
Yeah, I think we just need time to talk through some of the specifics, and it's doing it in comments is good. Doing it here is better. Doing it one-on-one over the phone is good too. I think we just need time to do that.
Because my sense is that this does not feel dramatically different from where we've been before in terms of issues that need to be.
We've landed on controversial things before where everyone is at least tolerant or comfortable, if not fully supportive. And, I'd like to think we can continue to do that.
I mean, that is my hope of this chapter, but Brian.
Just quickly, I just wanted to offer an apology to Danny. My editorial was, sounds like you took offense to that, and I meant nothing by it. Other than, as I said, I think I bring a unique perspective in that coming in, someone almost brand new to this and doing it. So I just, again, was offering kind of how my first read was on it. Hopefully I didn't offend anybody.
I thought your info was really important, Brian. Thank you. Danny, any last really important chapter, really important conversation? I feel optimistic that this chapter can, with some tweaks and conversation, be a consensus document.
I will reiterate my concern about the profound levels of corruption involved in this program and the lack of a conflicts policy. It is really very difficult. I have been dealing with these issues as a researcher, as a policy advisor, and I don't even know where to begin about just how out of whack this is. This entire chapter is designed to be balanced. It begins with EDF's preferred outcome. It strongly centers the views of tribes, and the first comments on it were, "Oh, we're not being fair to the tribes, another white man attacking the tribes," and it's an unbalanced editorial statement. Brian, I appreciate your apology. I thank you for that. All I can say is folks need to leave the California bubble. People do not think of this as a well-designed program outside of a small circle of lobbyists who continue to prop it up. Thank you.
Danny, can I just make a request? I appreciate your strong feelings, but we have as a committee worked like collegially, and I just want to try and avoid any really provocative, combative. I don't think it's necessary in this context. And if we could just, I hear you. I appreciate so much the work you're doing. If we could just proceed in a way that's a little bit less provocative, I think it will go better.
If we had Form 700 reporting requirements, we wouldn't have this conversation, but that's 7 years I've been losing that argument. Thank you.
Okay. I hear you, and I realize it is later but it will be top of the agenda next time. I hear your request. Any other comments on this chapter? Okay, thanks to Danny and Dallas for their work on that chapter, important. And we are going to turn next to the market design chapter, if we can, unless there's anything more to be said that hasn't been said on the offsets chapter. Do we need a break, or do we want to forge ahead?
I mean, we're going to try to wrap up at 3.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Dallas, do you mind leading the next conversation?
Sure, of course. I think this can be a brief conversation. The committee has talked about this issue since 2018, and it's been mentioned in one way or another every year. The fundamental point that's really interesting in the context of things we've talked about so far is that Danny and I wrote several years ago, started to emphasize the point that the carbon market represents a minority share of what California's total climate policy portfolio is. Danny wrote a whole book on the subject. But yet, nonetheless, the carbon market has a specific role because the various regulatory policies generally don't achieve that. They can achieve a specific outcome with, for example, the number of electric vehicle penetration or something like that, but they don't achieve a specific outcome with respect to emissions. And changes in many factors such as economic activity and ways that the scoping plan technologies are adopted and implemented lead to wide variations in emissions. And one of the functions that the carbon market does is it's like this sponge that absorbs or responds to the uncertainty that's reflected in other elements of California's climate policy. And that is reflected in the changes in the carbon price. Big problem is that when you see the success of out-of-market regulatory policies, like the city of San Diego doing something around promoting efficient neighborhoods or vehicle efficiency standards or what have you, that over a wide range of outcomes, including all outcomes that we've observed since 2017, at least notionally, until there's an administrative intervention, there's no change in emissions. That what I'm referring to, the fact is that just that the price changes, but the quantity doesn't change because the quantity is fixed in the declining cap of the program, and there's no adjustment in response to regulatory success. That gets triggered if the price falls the price floor, or if the price rose to such a high level as the allowance price containment reserve, then some additional allowances would enter the market. But over the wide range in all outcomes that we've observed since 2017, there's been no change in the cap. So consequently, this is, we've referred to as a waterbed effect, because if the city of San Diego is successful and pushes down emissions in one place, the same emissions come up somewhere else under an emissions cap, unless there's some kind of response. And the only kinds of response we see are much delayed administrative responses, either by CARB or maybe by the legislature, and program adjustments that really undermine the incentives for corporate, local government, individual actions to try to address the climate crisis. This is just a feature of bad program design. It also leads to greater revenue volatility to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And so we talk about the emissions containment reserve, which is the idea of one or multiple, but let's just say one additional price step in the program that would constrain the supply of allowances when allowance prices fall below a trigger price level. And there's an obvious place where that price step would occur. We've identified that in a previous report. And I point out in this chapter that in 2023, 3 times the price fell below that trigger price level. And each of those auctions, some allowances would not have entered the market to ratchet up the program, capturing the contributions from regulatory programs, and it would have coincidentally yielded $250 million more to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund in each of those auctions. And the same outcome has been observed 3 times in 2024. So that's over $1.5 billion that has not been available to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund because of this suggestion, which few, if any, arguments have ever been floated as to why the emission reduction, the emission containment reserve should not be implemented, but it never has. So we once again developed this in a full-throated way. It's a short chapter, and I'm going to just leave it at that and see if the committee can now or later offer comments on it. Danny's helped responded a bit to this both in previous years. Danny's a good co-author on this because in previous years he's also thought about this with me, but I didn't give much chance to respond or integrate his ideas into it this year. But maybe Danny has something he'd like to add here now.
I've been too busy to put in much time on your thoughtful draft. I'll just say, Dallas, again, having worked with you on this issue several times, have a lot of trust in your analysis. So very happy to have you lead and proceed. The only friendly comment I want to offer is what we discussed earlier. I think these are all no regrets suggestions. I love them. I'm totally on board. I think high price impacts are the thing I'm most concerned about. And that's not directly the focus of this. That's perfectly fine. We don't have to do anything different. I love what you've written here and appreciate it. Thank you.
I confess this, I have not had a chance to review this chapter of all the ones we have. I actually, largely for the same reason, I think these are no regret strategies that we have suggested before. And I appreciate you both continuing to beat the drum for sensible policy updates here. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that this chapter is here. It's no regrets. I would imagine one reason is it is complicated, right? And so I don't know, or it's more complicated. And so when I read this chapter and I was sort of trying to figure if I was a policymaker, like this isn't a very constructive reaction, but like a rule-based, how would it work? And I suspect that might be one reason why this suggestion is not being taken up, is it would be more complicated, but I agree that there are clear advantages. So I was thinking, is there anything that this chapter can do to make it more clear how that would actually work? But I don't think that is the job of this chapter. So I think the chapter does a great job in sort of elevating, once again, some really constructive and useful suggestions. We want to actually see it hit and be taken up. I was just trying to think, is there anything more that could be done to increase the chances that would happen? But
It's complicated to speak about, but very much not complicated to implement. It's an exact mirror of the price
Yep.
floor, which is already
Yep.
part of the electronic auction algorithm.
Yeah.
It's just another price step. It's been done
Yep.
in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So it's a pretty straightforward idea really. I think the main reason, and I don't mean to be pejorative when I say this, I think there's, some people favor rule-based approaches, some people favor administrative approaches, and retaining for the agency, the expert agency, the authority to try to make program adjustments on an ongoing basis. I think the main reason we don't see an emissions containment reserve is that it would put in more rule-based determination of how allowances enter the market, and
Yep.
And implicitly, if not intentionally, take some latitude away from CARB in making similar type of decisions.
Yeah.
But I think CARB could introduce this with regulation. It doesn't need legislation to do this. And I think it's an idea that stands on its own, but
Yep.
we will just continue to suggest it and see if the idea can move forward.
Yep. I think that's great. And it's a very readable chapter. I thought it was great. I was just like, is there any more like helping it along? But I thought it was great.
Yeah, I thought it was great too. In the interest of time, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dallas and Danny. Like, really important work again. And I am glad that it's included in the report. Okay, with an eye on the time, maybe we'll transition unless Brian, I'm sorry, did you have anything? I don't know that I gave you any opportunity to say anything about this chapter. Are you okay if we move on to carbon removal? I think that, yeah, okay. So I'm not sure who wants to lead this conversation. Someone.
Sure. Okay, so Brian and I worked on the carbon management chapter. And I think broadly what we try to do is certainly lean heavily on last year's chapter, which dealt with carbon capture and subsurface management. So trying not to just like restate everything Brian and Dallas wrote last year. And so we start by trying to, as we've talked about before, when we talked through the outline, sort of draw this distinction between point source carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere of legacy pollution, and that these are separate strategies that should be employed differently. We also try to really situate this within the scoping plan and some of the assumptions made in the scoping plan. I have a lot of issues with assumptions that are made in the scoping plan, but it is the plan that we have. And so I think trying to situate our recommendations, or not even just the analysis sort of within that, is important at this point. Broadly speaking, with respect to point source carbon capture, there isn't a lot that the legislature needs to do on this within the context of cap and trade. So it's really more just back to CARB to do any necessary rule updates that they see. With respect to carbon dioxide removal, there's potentially more role for the legislators to play if they want to, with respect to giving CARB direction for types of projects they would like to see, protocols they would like to be developed. And the recommendation that we suggest in here is hand this off to CARB, like give direction for what you want to see, the types of principles you want to see in place, and let CARB develop protocols akin to the offset protocols. And I think it is an open question, and we could certainly discuss, is this a third type of compliance instrument? Is this within the existing offset program? And I will say, I don't think I have strong feelings on that, but I suspect others do. And then we get into subsurface carbon storage very briefly, just to sort of reiterate, we need full implementation of SB 905. And so I think that is the quick summary. I understand, Danny, you have a lot of comments and some concerns about this. And I saw all of these when you posted them right before our meeting today. So I have not had a chance to closely read them and certainly not respond to them yet at this point. I will say, I won't speak for Brian. For myself, I think this is reflective of the outline that we had discussed previously, actually twice in here, and is certainly not intended to deviate far from that outline that I thought we were, generally on the same page about. So I'll stop there. Brian, what would you like to add?
I really don't have anything to add, Caitlin. I think you did a great job. Appreciate all the hard work that you did on this chapter and was honored to work with you.
Well, the feeling is mutual, so thank you, Brian.
I guess maybe also Danny, I want to make sure we hear from you. A couple of thoughts, and just you guys have thought about this much more than I have, but I think the point of departure for this chapter is carbon management is going to be, it could be increasingly important going forward, and it's going to interact, or it could interact with the cap and trade program in meaningful ways. And then in a extreme case,
one important point on that is we know there are members of the legislature who are very interested in how this works with cap and trade.
Yes.
So there is appetite to wanting to understand this.
Yeah.
Maybe for better and for worse.
And I guess what I thought that chapter was informative. My questions reveal my ignorance on some of these essential details. But I guess what I was thinking this chapter might do more of is just really elevate how this could be really important for the cap and trade program, and decisions we make today could have, they will have implications going forward. And maybe there's nothing, maybe that's a not very useful suggestion, but it just seems like, for example, the terms of trade, how do we count when a regulated entity deploys a carbon capture and storage project, how should that be counted? I guess what you're saying is defer to CARB entirely. And so maybe sorry, this is a poorly articulated. It just seems like there's a lot of weighty issues in this space. And is there more that the chapter could do to sort of focus attention? Or maybe what you're saying is legislators are plenty focused already, and there's not much more to be done. It just seems like this is so important.
Yeah.
And so new and different cap and trade programs are approaching it in different ways across the globe. And these are high stakes decisions. And as other chapters are sort of laying out some okay, these are trade-offs. I just wonder if there's more that can be done. But I want to defer to the people who've thought about this some more to be more constructive. And
I think the short answer is yes. There's probably a lot more we can do to get into perhaps more details of or more. Yeah, how could this be potentially important for the program? I will say, when I was working on this, I was very focused on brevity and not reiterating what we've said before. And maybe, I went too far in that direction, and we could use a little more discussion, and I'm very open to that. So.
Yeah, because I guess the summary recommendation should give guidance to develop protocols and there's just not as much, and maybe this is not the place for it to really
and then we have to align on all of the terminology and what all those things should be, and maybe we can do that, and I'm game to take a pass at that. I welcome others' thoughts. So.
Dallas, Danny, Helen. Danny?
Yeah, I don't know where to start. We had a long dedicated session to this topic that I think had a much broader coverage and discussion of the issues than I see reflected here. And this chapter says that the IEMAC endorses creating new offset protocols for the cap and trade program for these issues, and delegating that without any further anything to CARB, which, I think contrasts pretty strongly with the approach taken in the offsets chapter we discussed, where, again, welcome Caitlin and others' views on what's emitted or what's not. But the goal was to try and cover different points of view about the different options that policymakers have about how offsets could or should work. And this one simply says, go do offsets for carbon removal. And yeah, it's hard for me to know how to respond to that, because I don't think that point would have been lost on the chapter authors. So I'm sort of at a loss to explain why we have a chapter that comes down pretty dogmatically on an issue that we've been having some internal conversations about, particularly after we had a full IEMAC session dedicated to kind of a broader discussion of some of those issues where I thought we had advanced some constructive discussion and common ground. I don't see that here, and it's a little disappointing, but that's okay. It is what it is.
If I could just respond quickly, I don't think we say we're endorsing anything here. I think we're saying the legislature may want to give direction to CARB to do these things and consider these things as they do it. And I think that kind of recommendation, broadly speaking, is perfectly appropriate for IEMAC to be making on a number of issues that, like, these are the things you should be thinking about. This is what you should think about directing CARB to do. And I will say, you know, for me, my intention is certainly not to exclude other perspectives here. You know, like I said, I know we're all very busy. So I saw all of your comments a half hour before this meeting started. So I'm very happy to work through, you know, what other discussion we want to have in this chapter. But, you know, certainly no intention here to have this be something you're uncomfortable with or perceive as particularly dogmatic.
I just want to clarify, and I did get your comments late, so that's entirely on me and my availability. So by no means am I asking you to have read them, responded to them, or thought about them, but I don't think it's at all ambiguous that this chapter didn't reflect the discussions we've had earlier. We've had a lot of them as a group in public meetings, and that's the nature of the concern I was raising, not that, you know, of course, we'll have some engagement and back and forth, and I look forward to that constructively continuing. But yeah, this is pretty much do offsets and cap and trade, but for carbon removal without any discussion of either the challenges of how that's gone before or some of the alternative mechanisms that we've talked about for funding and supporting these directions. And I think, you know, I wish that it had been more inclusive from the start. I'm not asking you to have read and responded to my very late comments today. Thank you.
Do you think some of that is resolvable by, I mean, now that we sort of have all of our draft chapters, and I think we've talked in a lot of places about where we can cross-reference between chapters, and maybe this is something you want to think about, I don't know. Is it as simple as referencing concerns raised in the offset chapter, or do we need to also have that whole discussion here too, do you think?
I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel, but you know, it's hard for me to give you a clear answer because anytime I bring up, you know, problem or like 8 years of peer-reviewed literature, I get accused of bias, and I'm just struck that there really isn't any discussion here. I mean, I have professionally and in several capacities continued to work on the development of carbon removal methodologies. They are harder than forestry. They are harder than renewable energy. And you know, the idea that like just go forth and do it and like, wow, it's a bit of a leap. And I hope we can engage with that a little bit more responsibly than just saying, which what worries me here is this reads like, you know, the IEMAC endorses doing offsets for carbon removal. Yay, everybody go off to the races. The problem is solved. And I imagine that wasn't your intention, but it, you know, it certainly could be read that way.
Dallas?
I didn't engage on this chapter as much as I would like to have, especially after last year, having worked with Brian on the last year's chapter. But I see, first of all, one systematic problem in the chapter is there's a lot of use of the should word where I don't think there's a sufficient basis yet for the findings where should is used. And many of the same statements could survive if it was described as could, or one path forward would be, as opposed to making summary recommendations on points that are not thoroughly developed and maybe not supported in this document. The second thing is, I still, you know, there's a sort of an advantage of having a 10,000 foot view. I realize that there's been controversies around specific legislative proposals on this in California, and I'm happily I don't know too much about that, but I would still have liked to have seen this chapter come forward with a taxonomy of different ways that carbon removals could be regulated and enabled in a rigorous way. You know, whether it's in the cap and trade program, outside the cap and trade program, what kind of policy design and incentives are called for. So I would have liked to have seen a taxonomy of that. Maybe that's asking for too much put to work on other authors. So I guess those are the two main points I have here, and I'm not sure what we can. You know, I think that on paragraph by paragraph basis, I like what's in there now, but I'm not sure that that the conclusions about what should happen is supported by what's in the chapter.
That is very helpful. And I take your point about some more caveats and could, should, all of that. That's very helpful feedback. That's very actionable. On a taxonomy of like how this could be regulated, I mean, I think we can do more to say what it could look like within cap and trade. I'm a little reluctant to go beyond that, just because I'm not sure I have that expertise. I don't have that expertise. I'm not sure about it. And I think it would quickly get beyond the scope of what we're doing here. Because there's certainly many ways you could do this outside of the market as well. And maybe that's the point that needs to be made, is like this, dealing with this within cap and trade is one option. There's probably benefits to that option, but it's not the only option out there. And maybe that's what we need to say in here.
Yeah, if I could add to that, like there are reports out there that lay out a taxonomy. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I was struck, like the CARB should update the cap and trade program regulation to reflect captured emissions. That might not have been intended as a like endorsement, but it read that way. And I think it's not clear to me that that's the right way forward, especially in light of conversations we had. So I don't know if it's some combination of like existing taxonomies that say, look, you can just say no. It's like carbon capture that does not allow you to offset your, that's one option. There are lots of others. Here's like you just copy a graphic from some of the and cite them, but at least lay out the options. And that would be my suggestion. It may not have been intended, but I agree that this read like an endorsement of something that I don't think the IEMAC is endorsing.
I think having actually you read that statement with the should, and I think the way I was thinking of this is like if I am the legislature, because it's like the legislature telling CARB what they should do. That is what the legislature does. But I hear you now why that is reading very differently, and I appreciate that. And that is a very actionable, fixable thing. So
yeah, Danny.
I mean, the summary recommendation on the offset stuff is like far more direct. It says the legislature should give general advice to CARB to develop protocols for engineered and nature-based carbon dioxide removal, outlining principles of high integrity strategies. No specification. CARB should then undertake a regulatory process to develop such protocols and integrate them into the cap and trade program in the form of compliance credits in a manner similar to the treatment of offsets. That is not a fair and balanced discussion of the range of view or the taxonomies of approaches people have taken to supporting carbon dioxide removal in a net zero context. That is an endorsement of offsets straight, with no context, nuance, discussion, standards, or detail. But
and if you recall, when we had an outline, that was the direction we were going in.
Caitlin, I don't mean to interrupt you, but with respect, we've talked about this for years. We've had sessions talking about this. If you want to say I had a bullet point in an outline, so it's okay for me to do that, I respectfully suggest that's not the norm we ought to embrace as fellow committee members.
I'm not seeking to change any norms here. I welcome the feedback on the draft, and this is a helpful discussion with specific recommendations of what folks would like to see differently, and I welcome that, and I think this is doable.
Any other comments? So, I mean, I think, thank you for your work on this chapter. I think we've had a good discussion of how it read, and I don't think IEMAC is prepared to endorse.
Yeah, No,
these
I
kinds of
understand.
recommendations. And so let's edit and have continue the conversation. And I really, everybody, if we could, this is a really important chapter. So if we can continue to engage in making this more representative and something we can all agree with, that would be great. Good.
Good.
Okay. With an eye on the time, we have one more chapter. Caitlin's been working hard. Caitlin really led this. So if we could transition maybe quickly to the EJ, I don't want to, I want everybody to be heard, but I think we are supposed to end at, are we supposed to end at 3? Yes.
I think 3, yeah.
And I want to leave a little bit of time for process. So.
Okay. Okay, so this, the goal here was really to respond to some of the, not all of the EJAC recommendations, because there's a lot, but some of the key EJAC recommendations that have come up a lot, and all tied back to concerns about the market's impact or lack thereof on local air quality. And so some of the recommendations they've made are eliminating free allocation of allowances, eliminating free offsets, and instituting a no trade zone facility level cap. I know we've also talked about this is like a meet or exceed standard. So what we've tried to do here is sort of unpack very briefly the basis for those concerns, and sort of what the most recent research is, and then go through some of these recommendations and try to elucidate, like, these are the, frankly, just the pros and cons, and then options sort of within the universe of what EJAC is recommending that might balance some of the different considerations for the program. So achieving greenhouse gas reductions, cost containment, and certainly local air quality benefits and impacts on the greenhouse gas reduction fund. So, I mean, I certainly would welcome, where we have missed pros, cons, or alternative options that should be reflected here. I think the other sort of overarching question is, in a lot of these cases, to really get into pros, trade-offs and other options, we need to unpack the actual policy design feature a little more, like specifically how direct allocation to industry is done. We've done a lot of that here. It doesn't always make most sense for it to be here, and in some cases might make sense in another chapter, or cross-reference to work that's already existing in another chapter. So I think where you see those things, especially if they make the EJ message and options less clear, I think that would be really helpful feedback to hear from everybody.
Yeah, and I want to thank Caitlin for all your work. I think, some of my comments were not that it wasn't important, but just it sort of detract from the flow of the EJ conversation.
Can we put it somewhere else?
Yes,
Yeah.
it wasn't, but we should delete it.
Yep.
In the interest of time, would welcome, and this doesn't need not be the end of the conversation. This is what Google Docs are for, but it is a unique opportunity to have us all in one room. So if people have high level reactions or specifics, now would be a good time to raise them. Yes, Dallas.
In the interest of time, so I just one point, and I don't want to be a jerk, but I sent a bilateral communication to each of you with a perspective on this issue that I hold, and so I just want to take a second to articulate that verbally here, because the authors did respond or already embodied some of what I said, but I feel like the overall presentation of this is it's a representation or presentation of approaches or ideas that are not new, and I just don't see it's in the tea leaves that the decision makers are going to take into these actions, all of which have strong merits, but and I think there is a winning pathway that is moderate but represents a compromise, and I think a compromise is so important because I feel like we, need to be in the era of compromise and not in the era of like holding things back and saving them for reauthorization or something like that. And so just to articulate for the benefit of the committee, one place my view is that CARB could, I mean, we individually, we could identify facilities in disadvantaged and designated disadvantaged communities that are not achieving the annual rate of progress to meet or exceeding the state standard. That's public information. For CARB to identify such a list would be noteworthy. It would be press worthy.
Yep.
And then what does CARB do with that? It's like a jawboning exercise, which puts information out there that empowers community groups to interact with regulated facilities in their neighborhoods. And that is really a change in the dynamics of power at a community level. And then CARB could go a little bit further without disrupting the market or really very limited restriction on flexibility in the market. For example, precluding the use of offsets for facilities that are not achieving this meet or exceed standard, or requiring 2 allowances per ton for an exceedance of that standard. And this would just impose additional incentives and incremental costs on those facilities while putting a bright light on them that these historically overburdened communities should be at the front of the line for where emission reductions occur. They have to be there. And this gives a win to the EJAC committee that makes it so that we're all part of the same conversation and on the same team with respect to the efforts that are needed to address California's climate crisis. And rather than having this always be a zero-sum game, I think this is there's some compromise language that we could kind of embrace here. This is not to crowd out the stuff that's in the chapter already. I don't think we're putting forward identifying the way within the carbon market, because this isn't about the carbon market, how we could really help on this. So anyway, I want to leave that. Thanks.
No, and I just want to, and we did, I wanted this opportunity to actually understand, because in some senses information is available. In other senses, like it's hard to find. So I think what you're suggesting is like a TRI style, like let's really get that information out there as like, these are the facilities where the emissions, I wasn't clear what the prescription, what your idea was, so that we could like represent it accurately. So you're saying more of an public information campaign, potentially paired with, okay, if you're on this list, these are some of the things you have lost the right to do, be it use offsets or other levers that they might have at their disposal.
Yeah, I mean, the information campaign could begin right away, and then there could be a workshop, or maybe a year later, CARB thinks about, if it doesn't happen immediately, about some other minimal remedies, such as visiting the role of offsets for these facilities or something. And all that would just start to change the momentum of what the expectations are on facilities, without really restricting any of their ability to grow or their ability or flexibility within the market. It's just broadening the concept of the market so that it's benefiting all the communities in the state.
I would like to hear from Danny if he has thoughts. I mean, I guess I just like these communities, a lot of them know this already. They've been the ones pushing these facts that the facilities in their communities are not delivering the emissions reductions. I guess I just want to proceed carefully with this kind of suggestion, because I don't know how it would be received or how effective it would be. And that's not meant as in disrespectful to you, but I don't want to be like, help these communities understand. They understand as far as like most of what I've learned is from them.
Thank you, Meredith. That's very helpful, because I don't want to trivialize the issue. And I don't mean that at all, but I do think what you said before is that this information is there, but it's not like a TRI kind of a thing that would elevate it such that the Bee or the Times would have a story about it, exactly like what is the outcome for a given year. Information is power, and coupling that with even a minimal sanction would be really have a branding implication for these facilities.
Yeah, and I know we're at here's where Caitlin and I are coming. EJAC has a very carefully thought out list of requests. I don't know how to, and we really felt strongly about following that lead and saying, this is what EJAC is saying they want to see, and let's engage with that. And that was what we were using as our guide. And that is part of my reluctance to promoting some other idea that we've come up with when they have a very clearly articulated list. That's that if you hear hesitancy in our reception of your suggestion, that's where it's coming from.
Okay, I really don't want to disrupt that. So I've made my best case, but I hear you.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it is, I don't want to trivialize the work that the huge work EJAC has done. We should really be following EJAC's lead on this. So
That was our feeling.
Yeah, we might take it to EJAC and ask them more about it. But for now, you've been responsive to me, so I'm not going to push it further. It's something I can talk about, but the committee doesn't have to be the committee's messaging.
Okay. So we have 1 minute. Danny, I'll look into you if you have anything to say briefly. We have not talked about process, but I want to respect time. Do we have a quick thought as to when people could be, now that we have a good sense of what kind of work is available, what is we want to do to make the chapters responsive to the very good feedback they've received today? Like, is January 1st too late, too early, because that's got holidays in between? I'm really open to your.
I mean, I was gonna say January 3rd, just to make it that Friday, but I'm, like I said, I don't.
Yeah, I'm going to suggest later, even though I may be best positioned to get my work done in time, but I think that for all of us to interact and really come up with something tight, I would say January 8th. And then that to some extent that could shorten what we're hoping to be a public comment period, but it also could push back the final deadline a little bit. I also wonder if we should try to schedule another committee meeting at that time. And there might be just enough working days now that Bill could get that posted, and maybe that's how we close this process, is whatever the 10 working days that are necessary before another meeting.
We'll give it a shot. Looking at the pained expressions around the room, it might not work, but let's give it a shot. I feel it's like the Canadian me. I want us all to come together into some sort of consensus, and that's going to take time. And I want to give it that time rather than rush it through and have this document be something that people are angry about or really frustrated about. So maybe I'll follow up with a tentative January 8th idea for let's get the drafts finalized, and that involves engagement, over the holidays with people in Google Docs to try and get this document closer to something that people can agree with. Yes? Okay, sorry we're over time and we didn't have quite as much time to talk about process, but hopefully that gets us far enough that we know what to do next.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks for everybody's time and efforts and energy. Have a good holiday. Well, we don't have
Meredith, I think you have,
public comment. So I will stick around because I can. If others need to drop off, sorry. Public comment, we definitely need to have time for public comment, and I have time. So I'm sorry to run it so late up against the end. Are there members of the public who have comments? I realize it's hard because you haven't seen the documents, but you've certainly heard the conversation. Public will have time to respond, of course, to the draft that we released, but now is a good time to raise comments or concerns that can inform the editing and revising in the next weeks.
Meredith, I don't know that you can see, but Ken Johnson has his hand raised.
Oh, no, we can't see anything, but Bill, can you help us here? We can't see on the.
Amanda needs to unmute him.
Ken, I'm sorry. I know this is ridiculous. We can't see you. And we
he is unmuted.
Okay. Ken, sorry. We can hear you now, I think.
Am I online?
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, I think a useful role IMAC can play would be, not so much just, telling the legislature and CARB what to do, but more like encouraging the legislature to think through their legislative intent and existing statutes, and also trying to get CARB to be a little more clear about their statutory interpretation of existing mandates. And in particular, just 3 points of ambiguity in AB 1279. I think it would be good to get some clarification on the statute refers to statewide emissions. And is it the legislature's intent that, the state should aim to achieve net zero statewide emissions, meaning actual emissions within the state, or is it their intent that we could achieve net zero by, outsourcing emissions to other jurisdictions, via linkage and trading? So that's one thing that I think needs some clarification. Another point is the mandate to achieve net zero by 2045 in the context of cap and trade. If that's the instrument you're using, that's in conflict with the AB 398 price ceiling, which preempts the cap. So, I mean, probably a practical interpretation of AB 1279 would be to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible within the limit of the price ceiling. And then just one other third point, this isn't so much a point of ambiguity, but one about clarity, is that in CARB's statutory interpretation of AB 1279, does the phrase "as soon as possible" have actionable meaning? So, the IMAX perspectives and guidance on those issues, I think, would be helpful.
I appreciate those comments, Ken. I mean, I do want, some of the comments that you just raised are squarely in the cap and trade space, and that is our space, and others might be a little bit beyond, but I take your point. And I'm sorry I made you wait until after the meeting is over to get an opportunity to raise these, because they're useful.
Thank you.
Okay, we still can't see other folks, so we don't know if there are any, but I want to make sure we hear them if there are.
There are two. On my screen, I see Mick Scarla, followed by John Constantino, but that's just me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I'm
we
just
can't see
unmuted,
it.
so I think I might be next, if that's okay. This is Mick
Yeah.
Scarla. Yeah, it's, obviously it's kind of hard without having the chapters to kind of fully understand the conversation that's being had, but you've wanted to talk about kind of, I want to make sure that the upcoming rulemaking is captured in this, and that we've seen workshops on the removals somewhere between 180 million and 265 million metric tons of removals from the program, which is absolutely going to influence pricing, and that may change the conversation with regard to some of these pieces. And Dallas and I have had conversations on the ECR over, gosh, Dallas, I don't know how many years, but to borrow one of your terms about kind of the rules-based mechanism, we also want to make sure that we're not kind of washing over the rules-based cost containment that was negotiated into this program over multiple rulemakings and iterations. And it comes back to that kind of my initial comments in the first IEMAC hearing, which is there are decisions made about some of these pieces that are in those original rulemaking documents, the 2010 rulemaking that has like appendix A through J or something like that. And each of these discuss different elements. And so, Dr. Coleman's characterization of offsets under the cap versus over the cap, not exactly like that in California's program. It was designed as a system, and there are some allowances that were, there's some provisions within the rulemaking of where those allowances, or where we made room for offsets, and some of it was in the benchmarking, and some of it was in the allocations, and some of it was in the budget. And so it's not as cut and clear as maybe Washington, which is new, and they're just like, we're going to put it under the cap. It's some of the offset limit is around the cap, some of it's below the cap, and a lot of it's in how we benchmark facilities, because we set the benchmark and then we remove 10% immediately from the benchmark. And so it's how the system of programs works together, and it's not as cut and dry. And I want to kind of make that point that we need to characterize, if this is supposed to be a guide for the legislature, we need to make sure that we're characterizing the design of the program from those early days as well as the post reauthorization in AB 398 days correctly, so that they're getting both sides of the conversation. Because we've heard a lot about desired changes to the program, but the status quo is not, and the previous negotiations and 2/3 reauthorization are not being captured, at least from our side, but only seeing, and like only having been able to participate on these workshops. I don't have so I can't tell how
Sure.
deep you might go into that.
Okay, thank you. Just John, I heard it, John Constantino. I don't know if he's still with us, but if he
Yeah,
is.
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
Great. So Mick stole a little bit of my thunder. I was just going to talk about the offsets under the cap and how it was not set the way Washington did, and there's a lot more foundational policy. And I just wanted to highlight the policies of offsets include backstop, cost containment, and a variety of other things. And let's not just get, if there's a technical concern, we can focus on technical concerns, but let's not throw out the whole offset policy and all the work that was done to establish the system, as Mick was just commenting on. So I'll leave it there because I know we're over time. And then I'll just say from a process perspective, would love to have as much time as possible to review the chapter, because some of us actually have associations that we have to get official comment spot off on. So it's not like I could just review it and write a comment letter. I need to actually converse with folks who are part of this whole system. So a little bit of process, a little bit of thinking about the broader scope of where we're at, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, John. Again, flying blind here. We can't see anything. Are there other Dallas?
No other
James?
hands
Okay.
raised right now.
Okay, great. And I apologize for going over, but this seemed like a pretty important conversation to have while we could have it. Okay, so thanks to the public for being patient with us. I think we will wrap it there. Appreciate your efforts. Hope you have a good holiday, and we'll all be in touch for the work ahead so we can make these chapters, turn these chapters into a really useful, I hope, report. So thanks, everyone. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.